last month. Has it not stopped raining, or at least being like this, cloudy and overcast and kind of ugly. A little truth in advertising here. Tim has graciously called me a local historian. I'm not. I happen to know some history a little bit. I'm not trained in that arena. I'm a professor of chemistry, as he said. A little animated too, by the way. I will probably move around and not stay in one spot. One of my students 2 days ago looked at me and he said, "I don't understand how you can be so energetic at our 8 o'clock in the morning class." And I said, "That's how I keep you awake." Been doing this for about 40 years, but I'm not a historian, but I am a local yokel, some people might call me. I am from Strasburg, grew up here, and still have very close ties to this community in my heart, even though we live in Harrisonburg. The program is going to be on the crossings of Cedar Creek in 3 different eras. The original era when the colonists first started coming up the valley, the second era of the Valley Turnpike years, and then the third era, the modern era, as we redo things down there and have new crossings of Cedar Creek. So we'll be talking about that, and I have these visual displays. The reason for the Robert E. Lee cookies is because originally we planned on doing this program down at the farm that's co-owned by Martin and my families, inherited from my mother. Many of you remember Charlotte Downey, and you know that if Charlotte Downey was around, she'd be serving refreshments. And one of her favorites was the molasses cookie that Robert E. Lee enjoyed, served with cider properly, so hence that's the reason. And we appreciate all the refreshments that all members of the board and others made. It's back there on the table for us to dive into after we're done with it, so hurry up and get done with it. Crossings of Cedar Creek. There's been a lot in the news lately about something called Roe versus Wade. I don't know if you've heard about this, and I was reflecting on this. Isn't that just 2 different ways to get across the creek? We'll be talking about some other ways here in a few minutes. And I'm going to begin by taking us back to early European history in the Shenandoah Valley. As you know, should know, that Jamestown settled in 1607. Pretty much the eastern part of the state was well populated by the 1700s, but not so much west of the Blue Ridge. Shenandoah Valley is bordered by the Blue Ridge Mountains on one side and the Alleghenies on the other. And that Blue Ridge Mountain was kind of a barrier to migration coming from the east. And so most migration that occurred in the early years in the Shenandoah Valley came from Pennsylvania, across the Potomac, through Harper's Ferry area, and then on up the valley from the Winchester area. And in 1731, a fellow by the name of Yost Height received a 140,000 acre land patent to basically give land away in 1,000-acre chunks. And so he brought his family across the Potomac, came over to a place called the Apecan, which is just down the hill from Stephen City, and settled his immediate family there. And then his sons-in-law and daughters and other members of the family fanned out and settled at various and sundry other locations. And if you look at that settlement, if you're familiar with it, you think, well, they didn't stay close together. They really spread out quite some distance apart. Not simply, an hour walk or ride away from each other. They were well away. We had Long Meadows, we had Stevensburg, we have Frohman, we have the one that's most important to us here in Shenandoah County in Strasburg, George Bowman. And George Bowman's 1,000-acre land grant, the original land grant in Shenandoah County, the oldest homestead in Shenandoah County, right there on Cedar Creek. And the Stickley farm, as you see it today, was once a part of that original land grant. So that was the beginning of European settlement. Now, if you're moving from the Apecan up the Shenandoah Valley, you're going to follow the path of least resistance if you're on foot or having an ox cart or a wagon. And that path of least resistance at that time was what was known as the Great Indian Warrior Road, or the Indian Road for short. And there was a well-worn path, in fact there were well-worn paths, plural, through the Shenandoah Valley, but the main one, which follows essentially the trace of US Route 11 today, came right up the center of the valley. As you come forward, you see the Massanutten Mountain once you reach Middletown. And that Massanutten Mountain is a huge obstacle So you're either going to go left or right as you're heading southward. And if you go left, you have to cross the Shenandoah River. If you go right, you have fewer and smaller streams to cross in order to move south. Following this road meant then that you had the path of least resistance and became a major conduit for settlement in Kentucky and Tennessee and North Carolina and elsewhere. So this was a major path of transportation right through the heart of Shenandoah County. Now, if you're traveling on foot, on horseback, have a cart that you're pulling, and there's no bridges, you pretty much have the worst natural obstacle of all, the most life-threatening natural obstacle of all to cross, and that's streams of water, bodies of water. You're possibly going to lose property, livestock, possibly even lose your own life if the streams are swollen from rain runoff and dangerous. So what the settlers would do would be to establish what was called fords. A ford on Cedar Creek became known as Stickley Ford. And here is a picture of it. It is right down where the former bridge was. And for the last 80 plus years, that ford has been covered by the Highway 11 southbound lane on US 11. This summer, they removed that. And so this is a picture. Now, a ford is a place that a wagon can get across without getting mired down in the muck, where you can cross when it's under low flow conditions. And in this first era of colonization of the Shenandoah Valley, these fords were very important. And there were multiple ones on Cedar Creek, there were multiple ones on all the streams. But I'm sure at times there was loss of life, and times when the things were swollen, they simply could not get across it. Between the year 1810 and 1820, Shenandoah County's population doubled. It went from about 10,000 to about 20,000 in that 10-year period. There were lots of people coming here and populating this area and settling here. And being as that road was the main conduit, it got pretty torn up from all of that traffic, as you might suspect. There had been no hardening of it, no improvements of it. And I'll come back to that in just a little bit. But before I get there, one of the earliest accounts of anyone traveling that was written down was by a group of Moravian sectarians. This was a religious group in Europe that was, like everybody else, colonizing over here in the United States at the time. And there were 12 missionaries, they called them brothers, that traveled together with an ox cart, and they came up the valley in the fall of 1753. Came through this area in October the 19th. Now, October the 19th is kind of a special date in our family. October the 19th is the date that the Battle of Cedar Creek took place, which I'm sure you're familiar with. October the 19th is the date of which the last daughter of Daniel Stickley, the last heir of the Stickley farmstead, was buried in the Stickley Cemetery. October the 19th, when the Moravians came, and October the 19th was when Stephanie Downey was born. And I'm sure that was part of the prerequisite for Martin proposing. Be that as it may, they came through and they kept a journal. And I have a little excerpt of their journal right here. You've probably read this in Dr. Whalen's book. It was published in the early 1900s, and he extracted it for the history of Shenandoah County. And he talked about coming from Stephen City, what was Stephen City then, and they came 5 miles to what they call Bauman's Mill, which was a slight misspelling of Bowman. Bauman's Mill is this structure right here. It's a small square limestone building that sits down here in the brush alongside Cedar Creek. This is another picture of that very nice arch window that's in it. And this is my brother talking on a cell phone right next to it. I include this because it's kind of an anachronism. You got a 250-year-old mill right next to a modern cell phone. His son and I were working on the fence while we were doing this, so you can put on cell phone. At any rate, this mill was in operation at the time. They bought some oats there, which they had to wait to get threshed, and then they went on and camped in Strasburg that night. On the way, they lost one of their bags of oats and had to go back and get it. That's what they said in their journal. And then they went down into North Carolina from there and eventually founded the town known as Salem, North Carolina, which is now Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So as the state was maturing, we had the War of 1812, which was a big thing. The War of 1812 sort of brought home the fact that there weren't a whole lot of good maps to reconnoiter things with. The counties had been laid out, Frederick, Dunmore, and then Shenandoah from that after several years, as you all know the story. And so these county borders became established, and the state contracted with a man by the name of John Woods to create county maps. And he was supposed to draw 2 maps. These were all done by hand. One map would go to the county government, and the other one would go to the state. And the Woods map of 1820 of the area down here along the creek survives. And this is a reproduction of it. Very difficult to read, but you can look at this on the internet and zoom in. And if you do, you come down here right to where the Cedar Creek, at the southern edge of Frederick County, you can see where the stream was crossed by the road, the Great Indian Road, the Wagon Road, the Stage Road, they were calling it at that point in time in history because they ran stagecoaches on it. Many road names for what we call US 11. In fact, Wayland's, my favorite is Wayland's, where he calls it the Long Gray Trail or Stonewall Jackson's Way. You know, those are great names. We also have the Lee Highway, the Lee Jackson Highway. There's so many names. In Strasburg, we call it King Street or Queen Street, depending on which one you read.
Old Valley Pike.
Old Valley Pike is another one. Yes, so many names for one road. Pennsylvania Road, the Wagon Road, the Wilderness Road. All those names are interchangeable for parts of this highway. But be that as it may, the road crossed Cedar Creek at this ford right here on this map. And right next to it, he marked Breckville's Mill. All right, now who in the heck was Breckville? And where did this come from? Because this was Bowman's Mill. Well, George Bowman was the pioneer. He established the residence that's properly called Harmony Hall, Fort Bowman. And he built this mill about 3/4 of a mile away from where his house is. And we know it was here in 1753. It's probably closer to 1750 when it was actually built. No one really knows for sure. But what we do know is that it was sited pretty far from his house. And I was scratching my head. I was thinking, why the devil would anybody build their industrial operation so far away from the house? You get up in the morning, you don't want to walk 3/4 of a mile to go start things up at your business, right? And then it dawned on me, well, he built it because the Pike was there. The Pike, it wasn't called the Pike then, the road was there. So he was building it so he had access. And this was the important thing. And many mills were built in proximity to the highway where you could bring goods in and ship goods out and so forth. So that made sense. But there's another reason. And I consulted with my physics professor friends at JMU for this. And that is, Cedar Creek doesn't drop very much. It's not got waterfalls and things like that on it. It's a fairly low grading. And in order to achieve enough velocity to spin a water wheel, you had to have a really, really long tail race. And so below this mill was a long tail race that runs from where this mill is located all the way down past Harmony Hall. You can still see the vestiges of that if you walk down through there. And that tail race, that straight shot, pulls the water down and causes that water wheel to grind the grain to turn faster with more energy, especially during low water flow, which is very common on Cedar Creek, not this year. Okay, so that was the reason. And so this mill, in Wayland's book, he says it was one of 2 of the earliest mills in the area in the lower Shenandoah Valley. I'm not so sure that's correct, but it doesn't matter. You know, they were putting them up, lots of them, and of course the grain that was produced in this valley over the next century was tremendous. Before the grain belt out west, Shenandoah Valley was the grain producer, the breadbasket of the Confederacy. Excuse me. Now, I'm sorry about my bronchitis. I'm trying to fight that. This map here is a Yankee map. It was made during the war. As you know, the military needed maps in order to guide them around the valley. Of course, Jed Hotchkiss was Stonewall Jackson's map maker, and I had to resist the urge to put a Hotchkiss map on here. But this map here was a map that was made in 1862, and the Yankee cartographer took this map from the Woods map. But basically what he did was he changed features that had been changed from 1820 to 1862. And one of these features is a bridge that goes right across Cedar Creek there on Route 11. Okay, down below that you can see the original path down to the Stickley Ford. He also marked where a dam was for the dam that provided water for the mill by feeding water off Cedar Creek to it. So there's a lot of information in this kind of crudely drawn map. And this is just a piece of a very large map. I just expanded it so you can take a look at it. All right, so what happened between 1820 and 1862? And the answer to that is the Valley Turnpike. Okay? After the War of 1812, not only was the state interested in establishing all the features of the various counties by making maps, they also got very interested in improving the road system. Lots of people were living in the Shenandoah Valley at that point in time, and the roads were torn up. So they formed what was called the Valley Turnpike Company. And it took about 20 years for the Valley Turnpike Company to get itself cooking, so to speak. But all the prominent people of the era bought shares in the Turnpike Company at $25 a shot. It's a total of $250,000 to cost to build the road from Winchester to Harrisonburg, and then it was later on expanded to Stanton, points beyond in either direction. So they bought shares, and the stockholder company was a public-private partnership. The state bought 40% of the shares, and the private individuals had the remainder. And the idea was this was called a turnpike for a reason, and you know what that is. You know, it had a gate, a pike that turned as you went through it and you paid a toll. And so every day you go through your tolls. They were spaced at 5-mile intervals. There was one up here at Fisher's Hill. There was one in Middletown, so we were kind of right smack dab in the middle of one of the segments of it. I am told that if you traveled from one end to the other, it would cost you a little bit less than $5. In today's money, that's around $75. Okay, so it wasn't cheap. And then if you were a frequent user, you would have some sort of an agreement with the toll booth operator. I don't know if they call it speed pass or not. Something akin to that. At any rate, this toll road was supposed to be self-sustaining. The toll road was supposed to be whatever upkeep and maintenance there was to keep this thing going, they would invest in. Now, I'll come back to the bridge, but basically the bridge was built upstream of the mills at a bluff, and many of the bridges all were done in the same fashion to get them above the high water mark. And looking at the high water mark in Cedar Creek from the USGS gauge that's up beyond Aranda, they were pretty good. They were pretty good in estimating where to put the thing in order to avoid the floods that are inevitable. Okay? So that was upstream. David Stickley, Squire David Stickley, who was the grandson of a fellow by the name of Hans Stoickley, John Stickley, was one of the subscribers to this highway, and he made darn sure that road came right down in front of the mills, because they were operating those mills at that time, and this was commerce for them. All right, I'll come back to that. So, what's special about this road, aside from the fact that the bridges were created for the first time you could cross these streams without having to ford them? Although I will admit that the ford remained in operation until they built Highway 11 in 1929, where it was until recently. Okay? It remained in operation, and during the war between the states, the cavalry would always cross at the ford. They wouldn't cross the bridge, and the reason was because they could water their horses. Plus, it was hard, actually, to ride in formation across a bridge that small. So they would use the fords whenever they could. There was also a pontoon bridge that was put down there during the war that washed out in the flood. So, what was special about this road was it was called macadamized. Now, I know you've heard this before. Technology at the time was you'd take a road bed and you'd harden it by compacting the soil, dig a ditch on either side of it so that the water would drain off, and then you would take stones and hammer the stones in. You didn't use native material that was close by. You go out in the nearest field and gather up rock, or break some off of a ridge or something, and use the material that was around. And they had 3 sizes of stones that they used, and they made 4-inch layers for a total of 1 foot of macadamized surface. And in hammering the rock, you'd get a lot of dust, and that dust was used as cement to fill in. Well, a couple of years ago, my brother, his son, and I dug up an old post that was down at our barn. With the post was sunk in the macadam road. And so I took that opportunity while they were working to take some pictures of the hole that we dug. This is the post hole. that we dug. And these are a couple pictures, and you can see the sandwich layers of the macadam that are down underneath the ground there with the hammered stones in place in that particular location. There's tape measure to indicate what the depths were, and actually it turned out to be pretty close to true. So you had this, and then on top, it's a little hard to see back there in the back, but on top there's actually a layer of asphalt. Because as the road was getting older and more abused, they tried to save it by putting asphalt on its surface. And there's about a 2-inch layer of coal tar aggregate mix. They use coal tar as the material. Nowadays we use a petroleum product to make asphalt. But back then they used coal tar and tried to save the road by sealing it up on top. Didn't work. The road was eventually abandoned. But nonetheless, you can see that there. Okay? These are 2 pictures of the Valley Turnpike. This one was from Neasley's, and am I saying that right? Neasley's drugstore. Who knows anything about postcards? Where's Gloria? Neasley's, excuse me. All right, I didn't know how to say it. I thought Gloria was here.
She is. Over there in the corner.
Oh, they're hiding over there. Okay, she's got the postcard book. At any rate, Neasley. All right. This is his postcard, approximately 1906. That sounds about right. And this is a picture from up near where Martin's house is, Martin Stephanie's house is, looking down towards the farm. There's the rail fence. There's the road, and the farm is right down there in the foreground. And then Jubal Early published an autobiography, which was published after he was dead, which I guess it's not really an autobiography at that point. But at any rate, that book was published, and this picture here was in it. It was one of the pictures in his book. And he took a picture of the farm in about 1912. This shows the lane going down to the farm. Here's the farmhouse, the carriage shed, which is still there. And then this barn right here, which blew down in a 1962 tornado. Right here, lost that. So that's gone. But you can see the condition of the road. And basically the road was approximately 16 feet wide for travel lane, with about 2 to 4 feet of berm on either side of it in the drainage ditch. So it wasn't a very wide road. A modern highway, correct me if I'm wrong, Downey, is about 20 foot on a lane for a travel lane on a modern road. Is that right? He says yes. Right? This was half the size, less than half the size of a modern road. So I imagine there was probably lots of jam-ups, as people were going back and forth and encountering each other. All right. This picture up here is taken at the not taken, it's made by hand at the Stickley Ford and was published in Harper's in 1866. And it shows the Massanutten in the background. Here's the stream right here. And it's sort of an artist rendition of that location, and I included it for that reason. So you can take a look at that. I want to digress for a moment, and I want to talk about this gentleman right here. Daniel Stickley is why the Stickley Farm is named the Stickley Farm. And the Stickley Farm is named the Stickley Farm because that's what my mother decided it should be named. Daniel Stickley and his kin actually referred to the Stickley Farm as CedarCreek. So in all of their letters, they would always write the address CedarCreek, Strasburg, Virginia, on it. But be that as it may, the Stickley Farm, named after Daniel Stickley, was not part of the Stickley property. In 1738, John Stickley purchased some land from George Bowman, but this part of the land was not purchased by him, but it contained the mill complex. George Bowman had a son named George Bowman Jr., and along with a lot of other kids. George Bowman Jr. had the reputation of being a very large person. Giant of a man, he was described as. And he was challenged to carry 9 bags of grain up the flight of steps of this mill. This would have been a 3-story mill at the time, with the top 2 stories wooden. And he tried to do this, and he ruptured something and dropped dead at 18 years old. Now, by my calculations, 9 bags of feed have to be at least 450 pounds. So he didn't make it. His father had left him this property, the land surrounding it, about 180 acres or so, with the mills. But his father survived him. And when his father died, his will still left it to the dead son. So about 10 years after his father died, the family got together and they had to sue each other in order to work things out. They eventually, make a long story short, ended up selling off this piece of property two others outside the family. I think that's how Breakville got it. There was also a fellow by the name of Jacob Hummer. If anybody knows anything about him, I'd like to know. And then eventually it came down to two people, one of whom was named John Lee, and the other one who was named Joseph Spinger. And they were business partners and bought this property, but John Lee died prematurely in 1825. And so his family shipped it out to the Stickleys to operate, and the Stickleys built a second mill. And that was a larger mill that was adjacent to this one, and it actually replaced this one as the grist mill. And that's what's called the Stickley Mill. They operated it, but they didn't own it. And it wasn't until 1851 that this gentleman right here, Daniel Stickley, patched everything up and bought the entire property from the Lee heirs, the widow and all the children, and the Spangler that I mentioned before. So he bought this property, and that's how it became Stickley possession. All right? And he farmed it, and his wife was named Elizabeth Ann Rinker. She was from up Mill Creek, a little place up there called Walnut Springs. If anybody knows where that is. It's not the same as Walnut Springs in Rand. All right? She was the granddaughter of a Revolutionary War soldier and the daughter of a minister. And the minister got either tuberculosis or cancer and died, and left 3 children, Elizabeth being one of them. She was 19 years old when she married Daniel Stickley, who was 47. And that took place in 1849. When he married her, they probably thought it was a spring, December wedding, but as a matter of fact, he outlived her. She died from a stroke in 1872, and he lived until 1886. So he outlived her by a long shot. Be that as it may, they had 8 children. And of those 8 children, only 4 made it to adulthood. The rest of them died young. And although the Stickleys were never people who really told much about themselves publicly, in their writings you can see they always said the words, the Stickleys died young. Their one brother, his name was James Morgan Stickley, lived to age 22. And he died from eating nutmegs when he was in college. And they said it was a fraternity prank. I don't know if you know that nutmegs are poisonous, but only if you eat lots of them. You put a little bit on top of your pumpkin, it's going to be okay. But he apparently ingested the seeds. And his name was James Morgan Stickley. Daniel's name was Daniel Morgan Stickley. He was apparently named after the Daniel Morgan of Revolutionary War fame that lived in Winchester, because he was born the same year Daniel Morgan died. At any rate, they had four children that survived adulthood. James died in 1880 at college. That left 3. One of them was named Mary Virginia Stickley, and she went by Jenny. And everybody called her Cousin Jenny. And after her mom died, she became the matriarch of the family. Quoted Proverbs every day. Her sister was Laura Bates. She married an itinerant preacher by the name of Abram Bates, and that marriage didn't last very long. They ran him off. He was what we'd call a homeless brother in this day and age. And the other one was the other brother was Turner Ashby Stickley, named after, you got it, the Turner Ashby. So those 3 were the ones who survived until the 20th century. The big event, of course, there were many events that occurred down there on the farm. Being right next to the Valley Pike, the family suffered greatly during the war. All the livestock was gone, all the horses were gone. The crops were ravaged, the barn was destroyed by the Yankees. And then in 1864, they burned the mills. And that's what you see today when you go down there. You see the remnants of the mills. Now, I said there was another mill that was there. There was the 2 grist mills, the small Bowman mill and the larger Stickley mill. In between the 2 was a sawmill. It was a water-powered sawmill. And that water-powered sawmill was the money maker after the war. You've seen Gone with the Wind, I'm sure. And if you look at Gone with the Wind, when Scarlett goes back to Atlanta, and she makes money, they make money off selling building goods. This is what happened down at the Stickley farm. They ran the sawmill. That was apparently not too much challenge to rebuild after the war, because it was burned too. And they cut timber. On the other side of Cedar Creek, up on top of the hill, there is a large stand of pines. And that was what they basically exploited for timber that they sold from the farm. Okay, so it was the burning of the mills. Here's a picture of a mill around the year 1900 with Cousin Laura and Cousin Jenny walking up the hill past it, if you want to look closely at that. All right, now I got to get back to what I was really here for, which is talking about the crossings of Cedar Creek. This is the famous picture of the covered bridge. The covered bridge was burned by Ashby's cavalry first during the war, burned several times because it was burned and rebuilt. Probably not as a covered bridge, or as a wagon bridge, they called it. Just something to get across the creek during high water. But this bridge was a single span bridge. There was no central pier in it. And it's about 100 feet wide, isn't it, Martin? Yeah. About 100 feet from this bridge button to this button. You can see the limestone blocks that were used to support this. I am told that they used single trees to cross, to build a covered bridge like this. These are called stringer logs. And so you have two stringer logs and they build up the bridge structure from that. The question is why covered? And the answer is pretty obvious. It's weathering, but also prevents ice and snow from accumulating on the bridge, which would make it slick for travel. So there's other reasons for a covered bridge. And of course, these were very popular all over the state. Many of these were burned right here in Shenandoah County as the streams as you go up the Valley Pike during the war. This one was rebuilt and maintained from basically the end of the war until the early 1900s. Technology was what destroyed this bridge. Horses and buggies have wooden wheels with a metal rim. That's good for a macadam surface. They're light, carry less cargo. But at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, they had this thing called the horseless carriage that came along. The horseless carriage had rubber tires. And rubber tires, where the rubber meets the road as the commercial goes, are like little suction cups. And instead of packing down the macadam surface, they would suck it up, creating potholes and destroying the road. And this was what was the demise of the Valley Pike. In addition to this, it was too small, it was too narrow, and wouldn't hold much weight. And so as trucks got bigger and bigger, it became a safety hazard. The Valley Pike was being destroyed by modern traffic. The tolls that they were collecting were inadequate to keep it up. They were going into the hole big time. And so in the year 1918, the state said, enough of this, we're just going to buy off the stockholders, some of whom probably were ancestors of people in this room. We're going to buy off the stockholders, we'll give them 6 cents on the dollar and say goodbye. And they did. And all of a sudden, the toll road, the Valley Pike, became a free highway, relatively speaking. Supported at the taxpayer expense. So instead of paying a toll now, you pay a tax when you buy a gallon of gas. It comes back into road construction and maintenance. The date that the road became free was September the 1st, 1980. That was 100 years ago, 2 weeks ago. We should have had a celebration. I'm sure that nobody really noticed. Okay? 1980. After that, it's been a federal state highway ever since. Before that, though, they'd already tried to improve the road by putting a new bridge across it. This bridge here, which the locals refer to as the Iron Bridge, is a metal truss bridge, also known as a through truss. There's a whole bunch of different types of truss bridges. This is one of them. It reminds me of the one that used to go over to Sandy Hook here in town. That truss bridge lasted for a period of about 25 years. And at that point in time, the State Highway Department decided to create a new path for U.S. Roulette. Called US, yeah, sure, that'd be great. Called US 33 at that time. The road number was different than it is now. Thank you, Tim. Appreciate it. So, this is a picture from John Whalen's book. John Whalen died in 1962, but his Turnpike book was published in 1967. 5 years after he died, it was published by the Winchester-Frederick County Historical Society, and it's an unfinished document, but yet a treasured document. I don't know how many people have actually seen this book, but it's a nice little book of the Valley Turnpike, and in this he has a map right here, which I reproduced, of the change in positioning of the highway in 1929. Before, you'd come down off of Frederick County from Middletown, and you'd make a right turn to cross the bridge. And then as soon as you got across the bridge, you'd make a left, right angle turn. And then you'd come down in front of the farmhouse, and you'd make another right turn. And so basically you had a couple of what we call dog legs in this, and the idea was to smooth this out, bring the bridge downstream below the mills, and come up with a little bit better angle, and also make it bi-directional in a more modern fashion. The lanes there were were closer to 20 feet each, so you'd have bi-directional traffic on this bridge in this part. So that was the 1929 modification. When they built that, they built an earthen abutment on this side of the bridge, and basically they cut off the mill race. And at that point in time, that mill race has basically ceased to exist because it's blocked by this path. It didn't take very long before the accidents started happening there. This is an article from a Washington newspaper that was published in August of 1929. That was only a month after the road had opened with the new path. A woman by the name of Mrs. Alice Sherrote came down the hill with two teenagers in her car. One was her daughter and a friend. And they ran off the road. They ran down and rolled alongside Cedar Creek, and they were trapped in their car for a while before somebody finally figured out there'd been an accident and rescued them. They fortunately weren't hurt. Another accident that I copied the newspaper clipping of on here, which you can read, is about a fellow by the name of Raymond Borden. Raymond Borden, you may have known him, didn't have an arm. And the reason he didn't have an arm was because he ran into the truck of a man named Lambert at the bridge, and the wreck cost him his arm. He was the son of H.L. Borden, by the way. So those are two of many accidents that were occurring, because when you come down here, you're coming down the hill, which means you're probably going a little faster than you should be, and then you're going around a bend, and as you go around that bend, it's approximately a 50-degree turn to go back up the hill on the other side. And if you're not negotiating it properly, the road's slick, you're driving too fast or whatever, lots of opportunities. And there were fatalities at that bridge over the years. So in 1951, the state decided to build a second bridge about 200 yards or so farther down the creek. And that second bridge was to carry the traffic of northbound, the northbound side of the highway, and therefore you weren't bi-directional on this bridge anymore. And that was a great idea. In creating that second bridge, they actually separated a good chunk of the Stigley farm, about 15 acres or so in there, and isolated it. And the state acquired that as part of this second alignment. And that was the era of what we used to call, see, the USA and the Chevrolet, and they were all about building waysides, what they call waysides. And so they created between the two bridges what was called the Cedar Creek Wayside. We just always referred to it as the picnic area. And they had picnic tables there. They had water fountains. They had a restroom facility there at one time. I remember a telephone booth being over there. So there was a lot of picnics, church groups. Even during the 1960s when we had the reenactment of the war, there were reenactors over there. There's been lots of things that took place on that picnic area over the years. But with the things that are good and positive, there were also some nefarious things that took place over there. One person has told me that he owes the existence of his first child. I won't mention any names to that. If you have a special memory of, as Tim called it, the double bridges, the Cedar Creek Wayside picnic area, I have a piece of paper back there that you can write down your memories and tell me about. If you don't want to put your name, that's fine. You know, but I'd love to hear some of the anecdotes of what you did down there in the past. That's worth recording. So, the Cedar Creek Wayside, like any place that doesn't have an administrative unit associated with it, got vandalized, it got destroyed, and after a while the state just gave up and quit maintaining it. This was not something that they wanted to do anymore. And they put up some guardrails and let the place grow up in brush so that no one would bother with it anymore. Took the picnic tables and the grills and so forth away. At any rate, that part of the project took us to 1951, and now we move into the 21st century. In the year 2011, I learned that the Highway Department was considering replacing the 1929 bridge. This is a picture of the 1929 bridge here. This was a special bridge. It consisted of a metal truss that was called a pony truss, which basically means it's a little shorter and doesn't have a cross piece atop it. The engineers in here can tell me more about that. And then there was an access on the Shenandoah County side, this part right here, which was concrete. Now, the reason for this concrete side was because in 1936, March 18th, as a matter of fact, there was a major catastrophic flood in the Shenandoah Valley. And this bridge, the approach to it washed out. And the bridge was closed for 3 days. And remember, this was both directions at that time. And there was no other convenient crossings of Cedar Creek, and the traffic piled up in Middletown. Michael Kehoe has some interesting pictures of the traffic in Middletown at that time, all congregated around a little bar called Happy's. I remember Happy's, right there where the school is now. At any rate, this washed out, so they rebuilt it, and then they came back in 1965 and 66 and rebuilt it again. And that's what was there. And then this part was the part that was built in 1929. Now the bridge, the iron bridge that was over top of Cedar Creek, apparently, because it was only 25 years old, was salvaged. And they took that bridge to Salem, Virginia. And I tried to find it, and I can't, so it makes me think that they've since replaced that as well and sent it to recycling. This bridge, when it was demolished this summer, went to recycling. It's gone. No longer exists. All right, so the 2011, they came and they said, we're going to rebuild this bridge, and we're going to move it downstream a few feet and just have a brand new road and a brand new bridge, and it won't mess up anybody, and it'll be just fine. 2 years later, they decided, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to replace both bridges, because the other one's 1951, and that's not young either. I disagree with that. So we're going to replace that bridge too, and we're going to put them both on the same location. And then the fur started to fly, because that meant that all the traffic would have been right in front of the Stickley Farmhouse Lane, and we didn't particularly like that idea. So push came to shove, working with a bunch of different folks and politicians and whatnot. The road, the line was moved over to present-day northbound lane, so that is now carrying bi-directional traffic. All right, and that's the final result of the plan. So the way this project went in 2011 to present, actually the real construction started about a year and a half plus ago, and this is a picture of the bridge northbound lane that was replaced first. So they moved traffic over to the southbound lane bi-directionally. And recognizing how unsafe that was, they decided to make a very low speed limit and then enforce that with our gentleman in blue. And unfortunately, a number of our local community got tickets down there because they were going a little bit too fast around that bridge and coming up that hill. I don't know if that's anybody in this room, but that's what they tried to do in order to make sure that that was safe. And as far as I know, there were no accidents during this construction period. These are a couple of pictures of this bridge being demolished. This bridge was a 5-section, 4-pier bridge. So there's a lot of piers in the middle of Cedar Creek that would collect debris every time it flooded. It's been replaced with a 2-section, 1-pier bridge. So I guess technology is now that you can make your sections a lot longer than you did in the past and would support the bridge. So these two pictures are demolition pictures. These two pictures are construction of the new bridge. When the new bridge was constructed, here's a picture of it taken a couple weeks ago. Beautiful bridge. And they tried to make it artistically appealing for the battlefield with some faux stone inlaid in it. And it's not a bad looking bridge and it works well. Hopefully it will be safe. In May, they opened the bridge for northbound traffic only and kept the south one open for a space for people to get used to the situation. That was their thoughts. And then in July, they closed the southbound lane and opened it bi-directionally on the northbound lane. So that's what we have today, and we'll have that for the future. Both lanes of traffic going onto one road. By the way, they have a name for this in VDOT. When you take a 4-lane highway and you make it into a 2-lane highway, it's called a road diet. Never heard that before. Okay? After this bridge was opened and everything was done, then they went back to this bridge and demolished it. All the parts of this bridge were recycled, destroyed and recycled. They had to separate metal from concrete and so on. And then here's the same picture here as here of Cedar Creek looking up, and there's no bridge there anymore. All right, so it's open and flowing unvexed, as you might say, without any human structure on it anymore. And the ground has been resodded and seeded and so forth. Now, as a sidebar to this whole thing, on every bridge structure in Virginia, there is what is known as a bridge plate, also known as a bridge plaque. And the bridge plate basically gives the date of the bridge, of when it was finished or opened or constructed. And the original bridge plates were shields with the Department of Highways name written on them and the symbol of Sic Semper Tyrannis, you know, the goddess of the state. And here's a picture of the bridge plates from these two bridges. When I was working with the engineers and I asked them what were you going to do with the bridge plates, they said, I don't know, do you want them? Trick question. I said, yeah, I said I will take them under one condition. I said, and that condition was what? And I said, that I give them to the museum. These should be in the Strasburg Museum. So we are planning on doing a program similar to this, Crossings of Cedar Creek Part 2, in April at the museum banquet and presenting them to the VDOT. VDOT will present them to the museum people at that time. And then you can see them on there. But you can also see them today because they're back there on that table. So you can walk back and take a look at them. There was 2 of the shields, and then there was a rectangular plate that said Road Oak Iron and Bridge Works that was on this bridge right here. And you can actually see a rusty spot right there where it was on that bridge. And they took it off for us, and we really appreciate them saving that. When they were replacing the bridge over at Front Royal, they said they were going to save those 2 and give them to the town over there. So they came in the next day and somebody had taken a crowbar and pulled them and stole them. Yeah, unfortunately. So those were lost. So we were very fortunate, I think, to get those bridge plates. One of them says 1952. That's this bridge right here. The bridge was actually finished in 1951, but they make these things in advance, so they can't always get the year right. And then this one here says 1929, and then it also says 1966 for the reconstruction of that bridge. So I hear the music, which probably means I need to stop. So I basically am done. Please fill out the sheets about double bridges if you care to do that. Please have some refreshments at the Heritage Association, and my wife have provided back there, and enjoy. Thank you.